Pakistan economy is currently passing through a low growth phase. Our real sector, commodity producing sectors are facing subdued economic expansion, and of course there are short-term and long-term reasons for it. In the short term, of course, the country needs to achieve the necessary macroeconomic stability, and put simply, what this means is getting the current account as well as the fiscal deficit position in order. Now, when it comes to current account, the government has made decent progress, and we do see a narrowing down of the current account deficit lately. The burden of imports, which we used to see several months back, is no more there. And a critical factor in bringing the current account deficit in control was, of course, the market-determined exchange rate, which was allowed to come in play as a prior action to the IMF program, which the country negotiated. We also see that to support this current account stability, one would like to witness some increase in exports, remittances, foreign direct investments. So altogether, an increase in non-debt creating inflows in the country. Now, this of course has to be a medium to longer term agenda going forward, and the government will of course need to focus on critical reforms that allow barriers or constraints faced by exporters to be gradually rationalized, so that they can eventually lend foreign exchange for the country. On the fiscal deficit side, there are challenges which continue to persist. The foremost, of course, is our promise with the IMF to achieve a record high growth in tax revenues. We have committed for fiscal year 20 that the country will achieve a 5.5 trillion rupees of federal tax revenue. However, this now seems sort of overstretching given the current capacities, the administrative capacities in FBR as well as the provincial revenue authorities. And we do see the administration in the tax authorities coming under pressure. In the coming months, one may see a downward revision in this target as well. How would IMF look into this is of course a question mark. There is a IMF review which is due in December, and it is only then when we'll have to see if the government is able to convince the IMF on a downward revised target. Second, I think pressure also comes on the fiscal deficit from the expenditure side. There is not much room left to rationalize the current expenditure unless the government is able to take some very painful reforms. Of course, 2 or 3 such reforms which have been discussed. One, of course, is to drastically cut down the losses which are accruing from the public sector enterprises. Now, can the government do away, dispose of, privatize, or sort of transform the management of some of the loss-making public sector enterprises? That remains a political decision, and of course some strong executive level decision needs to be taken if one is to plug those losses. Second, of course, is the circular debt in energy that continues to drain the resources from the federal fiscal exchequer. On this, again, how much of the burden of lack of governance in generation companies or distribution companies can be transferred to the consumers. This again will test the government's political capital. They have already increased the electricity and gas tariffs. Of course, this again was the prior action for the fund program, but can a further increase in electricity and gas tariffs be done at the cost of political capital which the government has? Again, this requires an executive decision, and in case, for example, the circular debt is not brought under control, again, this is one area where further painful decisions may be required. Then, of course, the manifesto of PTI government supported rationalizing the size of federal government. That again is an area which we haven't, or a homework which we haven't accomplished. The size of the federal cabinet has in fact expanded. The current expenditures due to that size have also expanded. There is a case to merge federal level ministries and divisions, which should be pursued. And there's also room for bringing efficiency on the development budget side, and the duplicity of development schemes across the federal public sector development program and the provincial annual development programs can be addressed if the Council of Common Interest is able to put in place stronger development administration framework in the country. Currently, there's a lot of duplication across the provinces. One also feels that there has to be a longer-term response to our economic problems as well. The country will, of course, be able to stabilize in macro terms on the back of the IMF program. However, where would the future growth in Pakistan economy come from? That is the kind of strategic thinking that the government needs to lead. What would be the new sources of growth in the economy? How would jobs be created in the economy? And this is the kind of discussion which is so much necessary in a country where you have a majority youth population and you have a very narrow window until the time you are living with a demographic dividend. Now, to have a growth framework in place, two or three things are of course necessary. First is we need to allow room for entrepreneurship, and for this, critical reforms which remove or reduce regulatory burden on startups and small and medium enterprises is required. Self-employment opportunities or loans for self-employment is only half the answer to promoting entrepreneurship. The other is, of course, to bring down the cost of doing business in Pakistan, and of course stick to a very strong regulatory improvement program. The Prime Minister has constituted a high-powered committee for the initiative which is called Pakistan Regulatory Modernization Initiative. But under the 18th Amendment, the federal government will need to work very closely with provincial governments in reforming the way businesses are conducted in each of the provinces. Currently, all provinces have very different taxation structures. Provinces have very different business and export promotion schemes, and sometimes such fragmentation leads to misuse of economic incentives as well. We also feel that if such a plan is put in place, there would need to be some targeted intervention for the less developed regions in Pakistan. So one would like to see a special economic revival package for regions such as Balochistan or erstwhile FATA, for example. Probably here is a case for industrial policy, where you could have a targeted industrial policy for such areas which require a response from the government over the longer term. One would also like to see an expansion in investment diplomacy. There is a great competition across the world to attract foreign direct investment. For Pakistan, perhaps the best way forward is to attract FDI in sectors which have export potential. Here, probably the second phase of CPEC needs to be taken very seriously by the government. The second phase involves the development of special economic zones across across the country, and this could greatly facilitate those foreign investors wishing to come in the country who would sort of be more willing to enter if there are plug-and-play arrangements in place at the special economic zones, if you have single windows to access land, utilities, and other infrastructure requirements of these businesses. Of course, remaining within the second phase of CPEC, it will also be important to capitalize on the newly negotiated second phase of China-Pakistan Free Trade Agreement, and to see how this new FTA can encourage our Pakistani enterprises to become part of Chinese value chains going forward. China already has identified interest where Pakistani private sector goods can integrate in parts and components industry of China, and this is perhaps where a more synchronized response from Ministries of Industries and Production, Ministry of Commerce, and Board of Investment in Pakistan should come forward. We are also seeing that Pakistan in the coming days needs to sort of be more responsive to the investor demands when it comes to the energy sector. In energy, while the cabinet has approved a very strong forward-looking renewable energy policy, investors are standing out there to see that measures to ensure certainty of their cash flows are put in place. So the current leakages in the financial supply chain of energy sector, lack of assurances through which the pending receivables of some of the investors could be materialized. These are things which we need to address to give comfort and confidence to those investors who are wishing to enter in the renewable energy space in Pakistan, which carries a large potential because energy demand is projected to increase in the 6th largest population in the world. Then perhaps one would also like to see longer term reform measures to ensure that the sorry state of balance of payment crisis does not recur once Pakistan comes out of it this time. What are those things which could sort of prevent Pakistan from going back to IMF? So one of the things that perhaps can be done by this government in this direction is to ensure greater autonomy of the central bank. And while we do have a central bank autonomy legislation in place, that probably requires a strengthening so that episodes of fiscal dominance are not seen in future, and you don't have imports coming in the country which the country cannot afford on its own, and these aren't necessarily going into enhancing our competitiveness, rather going into that sort of consumption expenditure which probably the country cannot afford. So moving in the direction of providing greater autonomy to the central bank, allowing the central bank to sort of determine or remain with a market-determined exchange rate regime is probably one way of averting or ensuring that future balance of payment crisis are not seen in Pakistan. Alongside, of course, the country also needs to demonstrate a very strong debt management strategy. In the coming year and a half, of course, Pakistan's debt burden may increase because we need to retire the debt procured in the past by actually getting new short-term borrowings. However, beyond 2022, the country can, of course, put in place a very strong fiscal discipline so that future debt requirements are gradually reduced. In this regard, of course, the government has passed the new Public Finance Management Act, which is supposed to complement the Fiscal Responsibility and Debt Limitation Act, and it'll be best if the government can follow suit with very strong implementation of the PFM law, which was passed this year. There are also expectations of our development partners, of our trading partners, which need to be addressed. One such expectation comes in the form of certain recommendations which have been given to Pakistan by the Financial Action Task Force. Here again, of course, this is an area for the medium to longer term reform where Pakistan needs to stay the course. The country was in grey list previously, however, it managed to come out on the back of some very decent institutional measures which were taken between 2010 and 12. Going beyond that reform effort, one needs to demonstrate that institutional capacity to address the FATF requirements is quickly augmented. That's one, of course. Second, of course, where capacity is missing, technical assistance from FATF and other development partners could be requested so that institutions such as central bank or other regulators can quickly plug their own capacity gaps. Another area where FATF would like to see improvement is increased coordination between institutions which are involved in financial sector transparency or institutions responsible to act upon anti-money laundering or countering terrorist financing laws in Pakistan. Here, of course, the government has made a decent effort to establish a financial monitoring unit which now needs to ensure improved coordination across the regulatory bodies in Pakistan. Pakistan, of course, in the coming days needs to own this agenda as well and ensure that a repeat of 2012 is not seen, where the country did come out of the grey list and ended up going back towards a domain where probably Asia Pacific Group or FATF did not want to see the country. So all in all, we believe that the worst is over for Pakistan economy. The economy has largely, the external account has largely stabilized. However, structural reforms in the space of energy, taxation, public finance management, management of giving more autonomy to the central bank, these are areas where further structural reforms would be required in the coming days, along with the reform of public sector enterprises in the country. This should eventually put the economy on a high growth path where we can meet the growth rates of our peer economies, and eventually this allows us to create a job for a large number of youth who today, of course, are in need of direction in terms of employment, in terms of their future opportunities, and in terms of engaging with society as a whole.